if we need each other, then I'm led to believe that me lending a hand, doing my part, that's going to change my being just as it's going to potentially enable someone else to change their being. And the sense, right, we talked about community and trust earlier. There's also this sense that the more I lean into interdependence, the more I recognize that I haven't gained one thing on the spiritual path without someone else, right? Even having access to a teaching, it's because someone said it, someone wrote it down, someone put it in a book, someone donated it to a library, whatever, right? And I'm going to need more help down the line. That's just a fact. I know that. There's going to be times in my life when I'm going to need immense amount of help from other people. And so there's also this sense of trust too. Like,
yeah,
that feels really scary. Can I trust that community is going to hold me up when I need it? And that just feels also like a more real and vulnerable and humble way to be in the world and also to serve from.
This is the Beware How Show, a spiritual podcast covering mindfulness, creativity, and the perennial philosophy. I'm Bob Peck, speaking with Scott Stanley, Ryan Paget, Alina Kiriaki, and Maggie Burke. We're conscious creatives and formerly closeted mystics trying to unpack the inaccessible. Here at Beware How, we interview artists, activists, and teachers in the attempt to bring the spiritual wisdom of the mountaintop to the here and now. According to the mystics, the truth cannot be spoken, but we'll try to talk about it anyway. Hey y'all, I'm Bob Peck, and this is the Beware How Show. We're a lighthearted spiritual podcast, and we're deeply grateful to talk with artists, activists, and teachers, generally fascinating people whose stories inspire us and our listeners. A big part of this show is untangling misconceptions about spirituality, which I imagine we'll do quite a bit of this evening. It is Monday, August 2nd, and our guest is Sitaram Dass. Thanks so much for hanging out with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to be with you all.
Absolutely. Likewise. I'm going to read your bio, and we will jump right in. This is from Sitaram's first-person perspective here. I spent several years serving my beloved teacher, Ram Dass, on Maui. It was during this time that I committed myself to the practice of kirtan and the path of Bhakti yoga, the yoga of service and devotion to God. I also received the rare chance to be in close proximity to a man who truly lives from the heart. Whether he was lecturing on stage, at the dinner table with friends, or alone in his room, Ram Dass rested in and acted from a place of love. I believe that this is the most important thing anyone can learn: to live from the heart, to act from the heart, to sing from the heart. This is Ram Dass's main teaching, and it continues the teachings of his guru, the great saint Neem Karoli Baba, who said, "Love everyone, serve everyone, and remember God." I've also received my graduate degree in social work and now find myself singing, teaching, counseling, writing, serving in a wide variety of settings, ranging from yoga studios, music festivals, retreat centers to homeless shelters, mental health centers, hospice clinics, and prisons. You also just put out a really fantastic book, a collection of prose and poetry called For and From God, which is my current obsession right now. But before we get into Ram Dass and your book and the work that you do with Kripa, just tell us a bit about how it began for you. I know you said you were kind of a grassroots activist, counselor, general hippie that made your way to Maui.
Yeah. How did it all start? It's such an interesting question, right? Because when we're putting narratives to our lives, it's like, what moment are we picking as the starting point, for whatever particular story we're telling? Sometimes I think that it could have all started when I was just a really little kid, asking my dad questions about like infinity and not being able to get answers from him. and having to just wrestle with the fact that there was questions that didn't have tangible answers to them. Sometimes I think that maybe it all started when I fell in love with the movie Star Wars, and in high school learned that it was actually based on the work of this person, Joseph Campbell, and, but oftentimes when I tell the story of how it all started, it was in my late teens, and I was both really hungry for answers and questioning everything and devouring philosophy texts and all sorts of great literature. And I also had a lot of pain and addiction issues that I was working through, and just generally wasn't very satisfied with life. And it was around that time I was experimenting with psychedelics and had a few openings into something that I didn't have words for, but I also didn't necessarily know was real either before having those openings. And it gave me a little bit of an intuition that maybe there was something more than my mind could conceive of, and maybe there was more to life than just chasing pleasure and pushing away pain. And so that's often feels like the starting point of how things all started for me. And then through that, finding my way to various spiritual texts and practices, and starting to become drawn to Ram Dass as my primary teacher more and more, just through the fact that I found that his books resonated more than a lot of other ones. And from there, I got to find my way to spend time with him and to serve him full time as a caregiver. And that's really when I got to just get situated in the teachings and the practices so that it became more of a foundation rather than something that I was doing. Yeah.
That's lovely. Most of our mystic guests have an issue with that question. Not an issue, you know what I mean? But it's, people are like, my background, what does that even mean? Who am I?
Where do you start?
What's my identity?
Deciding where to start is a big choice, right? And it may be the biggest choice in any story, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, even, in terms of that book that I recently put out, it's a collection of writings, but also they were being curated to kind of tell a certain story. And all of those writings, have to do with my relationship with Ram Dass in some way, either in terms of the time when I was meeting him or spending time there, or the time when I left and was really grappling with those teachings in my life. And so that's also something that's just very present in my consciousness, is just this idea that we're always telling a story about ourselves in some way, form, other, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And so thinking about the way we're telling that story, what the starting point is, how we're describing the protagonist of it. And what's really interesting for myself as I look back on various times of my life, although the facts in that time period hasn't changed, the way that I tell the story about these various times in my life, it definitely changes. And I find that really fascinating.
Based on new plateaus that you've obtained in some way,
Yeah, perspective shifts. And in terms of my, counseling background, it's also really interesting. Cognitive behavioral therapy, there's exercises you'll do where, let's say we have really rigid, fixed views, like we tend to be really paranoid, right? And so we receive information and we tend to put it into this paranoid worldview. And so there's exercises where basically you'll ask someone, okay, with all the facts you just presented, I want you to provide me several different other ways you can tell the same story or draw meaning from it. And they can be ridiculous. It can involve superheroes. It can whatever. But the idea is to kind of create some elasticity in our minds so that these same facts aren't always drawing us towards these same conclusions and these same worldviews and these same narratives. And I think, especially right now with how polarized things are, I think this is something that we can all use a little bit more of.
I think you're absolutely right. The dynamic nature of Maya, if I may. Sitaram, I'm so touched by the community around Ram Dass and just everybody who really supported him in his, last couple of decades there. We've been really lucky. I think I mentioned this to you, but we interviewed Jeremy Hoffeld, who we're all obsessed with. I think his episode is called "Injecting Darshan into Feeds," uh, which is basically what he does. You
Yep.
open up Instagram and there's Sri Ramana instead of someone eating eggs and or whatever. And he's great. And just, all of you guys, really. I mean, we'll have to get into the kirtan groups and all of those retreats and workshops and dasima. We've all watched kind of the content that Jeremy's put out about that. And yeah, I don't know, maybe just tell us some, because I have like a couple of sticky notes on For and From God I'd love to read, or if you would like to read them. But before we jump into that, I'd love to hear more about the Maui days and just some of the stories from that community of really, just to me, really sincere seekers that came to support him.
Absolutely. Well, I like that you pointed out the community around Ram Dass, because it is a really beautiful group of people. And I would say my interactions with them and my time there at the house, that deepened the teachings for me just as much as my time with Ram Dass, really. One of the things that I have been really struck by in my thinking, actually, as we're talking about this idea of our perspective shifting and the way we see things changing over time, Ram Dass is an incredible being. I mean, with all this pain in his body, and his ability to really rest in loving awareness is incredible. And it's definitely a testament to the amount of practice he did in his life. But one of the things that over time I've been getting a more expanded awareness around is the fact that it's also a testament to how much love was there around him. That what enabled him to keep doing that work and to focus so single-pointedly on really grappling with the pain in his body in that way, and as he calls it, his own dark thoughts, and to really rest in that presence of grace within the heart, is he had a whole community of people there to ensure that his basic needs were met. And even his ability to die the way that he did, where he got to have the death that he wanted, that was made possible by a community of people that loved him and that were willing to put the conditions in place so that that could happen. And so it's really deepened for me this sense that, yes, we all have our own work to do, right? We have our own responsibility to engage in the practices that matter to us and to live in alignment with our values and to deepen into our own consciousness, but we don't do it alone. In fact, we can't, right? We are interdependent on each other. And when we realize that, it does, I think, awaken a deeper sense of humility and also dharma. I really want everyone to be able to have the chance to die the death that Ram Dass died. And that's within all of us, but we all know that it's harder when we're struggling so much to even get enough to eat. It's hard to even spend the time to even read the kind of texts that might open ourselves up to new ideas, right? So I love the fact that you started with that question, because it is a really open-hearted and loving community. And the other thing that I was really struck by in my time there was, at some point, the honeymoon phase kind of started to wear off, and I started to see other people's stuff, and I just started to figure out, I'm like, oh, like, this actually isn't any different than my own family. Like my own family that I was like born and raised in, and that I moved away from Washington to like be here on this island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Like you're all the exact same as them. You just might be different hangups, but
Everybody's got stuff.
yeah, all the stuff is still here.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting, though, is that because it was in this context of a community where people were sincerely trying to do their work, it allowed this sense of trust where I would see this, where if disagreements happened between two people, let's say with myself and someone else, and I'm, and they're, and, you know, we're so frustrated and we think that we're right. And there's this, it was easier to have that part of the mind that could start to see it as just, as you called it, Maya playing out, right? I could trust that for all their hangups, they're doing their work, and they could trust that I was doing my work. And so it made it easier for that other force to come through, you know, that presence of loving awareness where we could hold that dance between each other in a slightly different way. And that was really profound for me. It showed the importance of, I think, why universally in all religious and spiritual traditions, spiritual community is one of the foundations. In fact, it's said to be in a lot of traditions, even, yeah, it's in Buddhism, right? It's considered to be even more important than practice itself. So you can see that, and that the truth is when we've gotten that gift where it's a little bit easier, we see that the same work lies everywhere, that I can still bring that same presence with old friends, with family, with coworkers, with people cutting me off as I'm driving, right? That there doesn't have to be any separation with that. We all have our stuff. We're all doing the best we can. And here we are. So that, you know, in terms of the community, I can say that. And I also kind of heard in that there was a couple questions, you know, just maybe about what it's like to be around Ram Dass.
Just give us the stories.
Yeah.
We don't just want you for that, but that is a part of, you know, tell the goods.
Yeah. I will start by saying that the most profound thing I gained from there was really just the day-to-day of being in his presence. You know, there's not like, I have some good stories and I will tell them, but even more than that, there's just, when you're around someone that is really relating to their own body and their own identity in a different way, it's really quite profound. And there is a certain playfulness that came about that especially when I came to Maui, I didn't necessarily have that on my spiritual path. It was very serious. So here's a story. I'm not a big sports fan necessarily. I mean, I like playing sports. I did when I was young, but I'm not like I don't really watch sports. I'm kind of like a fair weather fan. You know, I might watch a championship game of some sport. But at some point I had some idea that, you know, spiritual people don't do that, you know. And I'm also on Maui, it's a very kind of new age community, and there's a lot of artists, and you know, it's not necessarily what you would think of as a football loving community, for instance. So here I am with all these ideas. And I'm so not plugged in anything. I have no idea that the Super Bowl is about to happen. And Jack Kornfield and an other Buddhist teacher were on island, and so they came to visit Ram Dass. They're old friends, and it happened to be the Super Bowl. And so we're like, we want to watch the Super Bowl. And so Ram Dass is like, all right, we're going to watch the Super Bowl. And this was the kicker on it was they brought, and I, you know, like this kind of lighthearted playfulness, they brought a pack of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer over to the house, you know, because it's the Super Bowl and like, that's what you do. And, you know, I mean, I know that Ram Dass didn't drink, and I'm sure even if Jack Kornfield enjoyed a glass of wine, I'm sure he doesn't drink Pabst Blue Ribbon. I'm sure that's not like a habit, but you know, it's the Super Bowl and they're going to do it. And that moment really, it just cracked a lot for me about what the spiritual path is really about. And, you know, we're really talking about a freedom in our being. And it's the kind of freedom that can allow ourselves to do something like that every once in a while because it's fun, you know. And they had so much fun together, like these friends that had known each other for like 50 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one little
love
story.
That.
Yeah.
I that's the main thing I think that I've learned from him. You know, and from afar, from a distance, but you know, in some ways intimately to me. You know, I got into religious documentary. That was my 20s. I was making very serious religious films. And before that, I was a child comedian. I was telling some friends about this the other night. I did stand up like when I was in middle school and did jokes about like video games, like Legend of Zelda jokes.
Oh yeah,
of like
I saw him.
when Scott was there, like when you go into the dungeon and you open up the treasure chest and there's a stick, like like can I get something better than this? You know, like those kind of jokes to 13-year-olds, and like killed.
He started early.
Yeah, I killed as a child comedian. And then I went to college, and I didn't go into comedy anymore. It just wasn't. I met funnier guys than me, you know, and it just was. I was reading spiritual texts and getting really into it, and so I was like, no, I'm gonna make spiritual films, and it's gonna be like super serious. And the film Scott and Ryan and I worked on is called The Kingdom Within. It's about yoga and Christianity. Played at film festivals. It was on Gaia. You know, it wasn't a huge thing, but it got out there a little bit, and it's very serious. It's you know, hardly lighthearted, and you know, it wasn't until, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago or something, really starting to just eat and breathe and live in Ram Dass. Mostly his lectures from the 80s. Those are the ones that really touched me, when he would talk about, you know, in the 60s and 70s, he's very serious Indian philosopher, and kind of late 70s, 80s, 90s, he's kind of satirizing himself and saw through the layers of himself, as you well know. And I was just like, oh my God, like it was stand-up comedy. Like he's doing comedy, but he's quoting Lao Tzu and quoting Rumi, and it was such a, you know, really touched my heart to show that you know, you don't have to take everything so seriously in the spiritual path. It's actually oppositional to it if you're really plugged in to your inner being. You know, a lot of that stuff really melts away. And so I'm glad that you tell a story about your own stereotypes. You know.
Well, that sense of humor of Ram Dass, that definitely never went away. I mean, he was so funny. And even with the stroke and words wouldn't come so much, he still found a way to work it, you know, with what he had. And here's another little story. So one of my job, I mean, so Dasima was the main caregiver at that time. And especially when I was there, she was still able to do a lot of the physical caregiving. Over the years, Ram Dass's needs became more and more intense, and Dasima got older herself. And so there was more help needed, and they would have more younger people there. But at that point, it was just me and Dasima and Ram Dass living at the house. And one of the main jobs that they wanted me there for, besides all the other little help I was giving, was essentially just in case anything happened that I could pick him up. And so there was one night where Dasima woke me up, and you know, I was like a bear. It's awful waking me up. It takes me like 10 minutes, 20 minutes for my brain to like activate. And I'm just like, oh, what's going on? Dasima's like, Ram Dass fell out of bed. You have to come upstairs. And, you know, she's really panicked. I'm just like, what? Okay, you know, and I'm like annoyed because I just woke up, but she just said this thing. So I know I shouldn't be. I'm like, okay. So I get dressed. I go upstairs, and yeah, Ram Dass was laying on the floor, and he'd fallen out of bed. And that's obviously really scary, and it's dangerous. You know, he could have broke something, and all of those things. I mean, him going back to the hospital could mean an infection arises. I mean, all of these things, even though he was relatively healthy, given his situation, death was always a possibility right around the corner, right? So this is a serious moment. So I go down, I managed to lift him up off the ground and get him back into bed. And so there's this moment, and Dasima and I were just standing there, and we're kind of just staring at him, you know, like just what just happened, and like, do we go, you know, just, is he okay? And so we're just standing there in silence, staring at him. And a couple seconds goes by, and Ram Dass just says, well, that's all, folks. And it was just this perfect diffusion of the situation. And, you know, we all got to laugh and go downstairs. But you know, even his ability to crack a joke in a moment like that, you know, it's like so simple and sweet, but it touches upon his humor and also just his character. Yeah, absolutely.
Love it.
I had back to the community note of it. One of the lines that jumped out to me in the Netflix documentary was something he said about that, in our culture, dependency is a no-no, kind of. And I was curious, like how, the community kind of worked to undo that culture or try to replace it with something new, and how you did that and with him and how he tried to.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there's two sides of that, right? There's my own work with it, and then there's the work that Ram Dass is doing himself. And on my own side of it, Ram Dass was my teacher. I mean, I really revered him. And so it was never possible for me to view the act of me caregiving him as any type of less than situation. So my work from that and my lesson in that is really just that's that involved obviously in some sense my unique relationship with him, maybe my own projections, right? Whatever. But that inner state of being able to serve someone joyfully and to do it as an act of true service where there's no power over relationship, that's an innate quality of our own human heart, right? That exists within me. Otherwise, that wouldn't have been possible. And so since then, as I'm doing service work in the world in general, and, I've worked in hospice centers and homeless centers and worked as a grief counselor and mental health therapist. And that's really what I'm always trying to come back to, is that we need each other and service is a part of that dance, and that it is a true honor to be able to be there for someone. And that for my own self, the truth is that I can't do this alone either. I also need other people. And that's where it also connects to the work that I saw Ram Dass do. Part of the reason that he was so in touch with those teachings is because he saw them in himself. Dependency was not easy for him. And it wasn't just it wasn't a light switch, right? Because what happens is the body slowly over time needs more and more and more help. There's more dependency, right? So as Ram Dass's body got weaker in various ways and he needed help that he was once able to do, even though he had already accepted help and had already worked through it, it was a new terrain. It was a new area that he had to work through. And I saw him work through it. And that was the part of him that was very human and really tackled it with nobility. I mean, it was a struggle, and he actively struggled with it. And I got to see that continued relationship with it change over time as he continued to surrender more and more. Whereas towards the end, he could hardly do anything. And he just really got to rest in that spaciousness of awareness.
And don't you think, Sitaram, and I mean, everybody else, feel free to jump in here. The Eastern contemplative practices of the witness, of detaching from the identity, I mean, that is a invaluable tool in the process of aging. I mean, I feel like I'm already, I'm obviously still young and healthy, but I'm 33 and I get fatigued, and, there's still bandwidth energy here and there that's popping up. It's like the ripening and rotting of the body over time. And, in the Western world, we think we're starting to decay the self is. And the Eastern vantage point is that you're eternal. You're beyond this meager, transitory identity. And must that have been a massive aid to him in his exceptionally painful, departure?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. And he really, here's another little story that can kind of put into perspective just where he was at in his consciousness. This one day, his sense of time wasn't that great. It was one of the things that the stroke impacted. And this happened every once in a while, not all that often. I mean, he could look at a clock and see what time it was, but sometimes he would get confused and he would come downstairs early for dinner or something. And on this one particular day, he came down and it was an hour early. And we were planning to sit out on the back patio to eat. And so he was down there and I saw the time. I was like, well, I don't know if he knows, so I went back down and I told him, I said, hey, Ram Dass, dinner's not for another hour. And he said, oh, really? And I was like, yeah. I could tell he was a little bit surprised. He says, okay, well, I guess I'll just sit here. And so I went back upstairs and I was talking with the person that was helping make dinner, basically. And I could see out the window him down there on the patio. And I was looking out periodically and he literally wasn't doing anything. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't reading the paper. He wasn't necessarily meditating either in the way that maybe I would meditate, where it's a real practice and I'm sitting down and there's probably some sense of struggle, to stay present. He was really just there and looking out at the ocean and appreciating the beauty and just totally present. And the thing is that that's what he was doing upstairs before he came down. So that's,
Wow.
it's both a practice for him and it was a state of awareness that he had earned through that practice, to just really be in that witnessing consciousness. So yeah, absolutely. And I think the reality is for most of us, especially those of us that are younger, look, we are in the world and we do have these minds and these intellects and these bodies, and we have our duties to our family and to each other and our communities and to democracy, and right, we have things to do in the world. And so for us, the practice is a little bit different, right? We're cultivating that witness through the act of action itself. But in some sense, it's no different, and us practicing now in the midst of all this, that's what's going to make it easier when we can't do as much. And a lot of the stuff that we have to work with are at deeper and subtler levels because we're face to face with our own mortality, the terror of death. I do a lot of grief counseling, and one of the things that I think gets lost when we even think about this idea of the self being eternal is the fact that who we think we are is actually all we know. So everything that we think we know about ourselves is going to die, and that is literally and absolutely terrifying. Our body-mind system, it's a really deep part of what it means to be alive, that fear of death. And so just realizing that is something that we too need to be present with and watch with that witnessing consciousness. This is a really rich journey that we're on. And there's a lot of layers, but regardless of where we're at and whatever stage of life we're in, that developing that witnessing consciousness, deepening that capacity for compassion and loving awareness, as far as I can tell at this stage, it might be applied differently in different situations, but it is universally applicable.
Well said. I can keep blabbing. Anybody else? I have so much to say, but I'd rather let you guys talk.
No, totally. I'll jump in. First of all, just really grateful to be chatting with you and hearing some of your stories. And I just really love everything that you've shared so far, especially things about your process too. So thank you. One thing that really stood out to me is this idea of community. That's something that I too, in the last couple of years, has, come into my awareness and has totally changed my life. I have a small spiritual community, a group of people that are actually living together in a shared property. And I've had the opportunity to become really close with the work that they're doing. And the impact of having people around you all the time, often, is so powerful, so powerful. And I think it's really easy in our contemporary kind of lives, where we might have just ourselves or a partner, and we have a spiritual practice, but you're insulated in a way, a little bit. And hopefully your partner is supportive of your practice as you are theirs, and you can grow in that way. But when you're surrounded by multiple people, it just changes. It's just things become much more apparent, much quicker, and things come out much quicker, and things need to be worked through. And it's just such a blessing. And so I was just really resonating with what you were sharing about, the love that Ram Dass was cultivating was, probably largely influenced by the love that was around him, and that community that was around him. And I can say the exact same for my work in the last 2 years. My sense of love within myself has grown exponentially, directly connected to the group of people that I've surrounded myself with, and how closely I've surrounded myself with them, and all of us being very dedicated, and holding each other accountable, and showing us, each other our blind spots, and helping each other through that process. It's really, really beautiful. And I just was really resonating with that. So wanted to plus one onto that. That sense of community, I think, is really important. It's your sangha,
Well, I'll transition to appreciation for this group. We had another mystic content creator named Zevi Slavin, Rabbi Zevi in Jerusalem. His channel is Seekers of Unity. He's terrific. And he goes, at some point he goes, man, I love that it's you guys on the, together. It's kind of tough doing it by yourself, and I was like, absolutely. I depend on these people. Maggie Burke has just joined us, so we're 5 kind of rotating in and out. And, when I'm going to publish something on Medium or something, these guys get it. And hey, is this any good? Is this, what can I clean up? What part of the podcast was useful? Like the creative collaboration from a real soulful level is extremely valuable for me. And so reciprocating that gratitude to you guys.
Yeah, it's been my life focus. Is creative collaboration is all I seem to want to spend, my time on.
Time doing.
So
exactly.
Years and years.
Yeah, and I think that's a really
enough.
nice segue into the work with Kripa. Sitaram, tell us about the kirtan work and really all of you former caretakers, as we were seeing on the site. It's Evan and tell us more.
Yeah, so I am a part of a kirtan group. There's 4 of us, and we all were leading kirtan on our own in different ways, and involved in different service projects in different ways. And we just decided how cool it would be for us just to do it together. And it's interesting because I had to rework a lot of things through that process, talking about just the joy and the gift of collaboration, right? There's often, for myself, I was very used to putting on my own kirtan events, and the whole 2 hours are mine. And, I'm inviting other musicians there, but I'm still the one leading the chants. And, I'm just used to kind of creating it in a certain way. And so it meant, essentially when I'm with them, I'm leading chants like 25% of the time, and sometimes getting mad if I feel like their time management isn't as good as mine. I'm like getting squeezed out because I was last. But
the bliss just tempers a little bit.
But also even this idea of collaboration, right? I'm such a perfectionist that for me, collaborating, I'm just so used to working on something for a really long time, to the point where I'm fine-tuning individual parts and going back and forth for weeks until I'm like, okay, I'm now considering this a draft, and I'm going to show it to someone to see what they think, right? And realizing that, there's a time and place for that, but actually, if I'm willing to be vulnerable and to show like very messy and unfinished projects to people earlier on in the process, that that can actually invite all sorts of different creative potential that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. It can speed things up. And so that's also been really a powerful learning thing for me in this artistic collaboration with them, in terms of just being willing to be very vulnerable in the creative process, you know, because when you're giving your soul to something like that and you really believe in it, it feels very vulnerable. I mean, it feels like you're kind of showing your naked self to someone. And so that has definitely been a part of my leading edge in collaboration, is being willing to show imperfect things with people, to start collaborating earlier on. But
I'm smiling because these are three perfectionists and I'm the messy one. We're all learning.
1
Very much
million,
resonate.
1 million rounds of editing is my general preference. But I'm working on it. I'm trying to be better about it.
Yeah.
Well, there's some point where there's actually a over intellectualization aspect. Right?
Oh, big time.
You lose the juice when you
big time.
You want it to get it to a certain point, but then you can work it too much.
Right. And we all here know we get to this point, especially if it's just us, where it's like, okay, you finally realize that you just need to put it down for a while because you don't have that outside perspective. And for me, sometimes it's allowing myself just to forget about it and come back months later, right? But in the act of collaboration, you know, some of those things, it doesn't have to be so extreme anymore, you know, because you get those other mirrors in the process. But for that to work, and this is where community itself is a very vulnerable thing, for that to work, there has to be some sense of trust. You have to trust that someone else is going to be really kind and gentle with this imperfect self that you've shown to someone. And, you know, I mean, that's one of the things I've learned on my spiritual path, especially as I've really grappled with the spiritual teaching of satya, or truth, right? Being truthful and honest, is also recognizing that I don't have to show my whole self to everyone. You know, I'm allowed to take care of myself. And if there's certain people that it's just not worth my time or energy to show those parts of myself, that I don't have to do that, right? That can be an act of self-kindness in that. So also that's a real gift when we can have a community of people where that sense of trust is there, where we know that people are going to treat what we show them of ourselves, whether it's creative or otherwise, right? As we show them our stuff, there's going to be some sense of kindness shown. That's a huge, powerful gift.
You're here.
Yeah. So Kripa, we're a Kirtan group. It's call and response Sanskrit chanting. And we are very focused. For us, our core logic model is sacred community, which is rooted in interdependence. And it means that we don't feel like you can anymore in this day and age, especially, we never could, but especially now, it's becoming increasingly apparent that we can't separate the systemic, the communal, the relational, the personal, the political, or the sacred, right? That this is all woven together in our daily lives. And so bringing our full selves to all of it and not trying to separate it is a healthier way to live. And so with that, we really want to work to ensure that the teachings and the practices of Bhakti Yoga specifically, but in general, devotional and contemplative practices, are available to anyone, that the barriers of access can be lowered. And that language is really specific for us because we don't feel like we're providing access. We're essentially undoing something that has been created, right? If not all of us have access to something, it's because collectively as a society, we've set things up in a way so that it makes it more difficult for certain people to receive various benefits than others. So what that means in a practical sense is that we really strive to provide donation-based, free, low-cost, sliding scale, retreats, workshops, media. That's one way that we work to lower the barriers of access. And another way, a very tangible way is doing outreach to people, incarcerated individuals in the prison system, right? Literally a group of people that as a society we have separated physically, often in very rural and remote areas where we can kind of pretend that the people don't exist there. So we've been doing that outreach, which before COVID meant going into prisons and singing kirtan with people. That is obviously on hold for a lot of reasons, but we've still been engaging through letter writing, providing resources. And, as of a few weeks ago, I was really convinced that in the spring of 2022, we'd be able to do another prison kirtan tour. Right now with the Delta variant, I'm back to just not knowing again. But eventually, we will be able to go back in again and to provide chanting with people and to form community in that aspect. And so that's the short of it, is the work that we're doing together. And it really did grow out of our desire. Our friendship with each other is one of the ways that we keep our love of Ram Dass alive in our hearts, and his presence alive, and the teachings alive for us. So yeah.
So beautiful. Sincere honoring of that work. And, Ram Dass himself was such a tireless advocate. If our listeners aren't familiar, not only was he the author of Be Here Now and a brilliant philosopher in his own right, that's all he did, was help people. He fed people. He did what Maharaji said. He went to Nepal, and they cured blindness with the Seva Foundation and the Prison Ashram Project. To my understanding, he was, if not a co-founding member, but a really early, part of that. And I know him and Bo Lozoff that wrote Inside Out, which I cherish, which is like this little prison manual for how to kind of learn yoga practices and get exposed to teachings from Gandhi and, everyone interesting, basically. So, in a very real way, you guys are carrying on that tradition. So hearty, sincere honoring of that. Melina and I actually got officially approved, or I did. I think you were about to submit it and then COVID happened, but we got officially approved by the Texas Department of Justice or whatever to go in to teach meditation to prisons in the area, and then COVID happened. So similarly sidelined for now, but my seva has been, and Ryan too, has been a lot of food bank work over the years, and Ram Dass's lectures have really inspired me to do prison work. So I kind of can't wait to get in there as well. I know that it must be so transformative. My uncle was in prison for many years, and it's a special seva in my heart. So really appreciate the work you guys are doing. Any interesting stories or about the impact that you guys have made with our incarcerated brothers and sisters?
Well, I know that we've made an impact, but what's even more obvious to me is the impact that this kind of work has had on me.
Sure.
Which is that, I think for a long time, both in spiritual communities and even in therapeutic communities, we had this idea that worrying about the plight of the world was some projection in some sense, right? That essentially it was some way to escape ourselves. And it's not that there's not some truth to that, or that can be true in some ways. Sometimes we do get really fixated on external events because we can't deal with this pain inside of us. But I think we've also come full circle, and I've really seen this in myself, that because I don't think that my own thinking is even my own, right? There's so many influences on the way that I think, and a lot of them are unconscious. And when we think about dominant culture and its influence on all of us, what that means is that our collective blind spots, I find that mirrored in my own being. And so by focusing on these areas where I know I have blind spots, the prison system, as I brought up, is a really powerful one, because, it's physically, we are removing people so that we can pretend that they don't exist. And then all of the intersecting forces of classism and racism that intersect with that, right? These are all really big collective blind spots. Those exist in my own being. And so by me taking the time to look at these collective issues and to make it personal in some sense, I get to shine a light on these other parts of my being. So essentially, I'm trying to take the teaching, love everyone, literal, right? We do not love everyone as a culture. We don't. We don't treat everyone as if we love them. And I'm a part of that. I'm not separate from the system in any way. I can't pretend that that's the case, even though in my day-to-day I do pretend. I mean, we all have our coping strategies that we use to pretend that we're not a part of this, or to pretend that we're happy with the way things are. We all feel that deep pain that comes from being connected to each other and to know that we're not living in harmony with their deepest values. So for me, that's this element of sacred community and seeing that I can't separate these elements anymore and that they're all connected. And so, yeah, by me putting boots on the ground, so to speak, and really doing that hands-on service work, it is changing me. And so it's questionable in any situation how much helping is helping someone else. I do know that we're doing good work, but I definitely know in a very deep and visceral way what it's doing for me in terms of transforming my being.
Hear, hear. I love that you're integrating Advaitin kind of non-duality alongside of karma yoga. That's kind of what I'm hearing is if it's all a projection. Also, I just saw Ryan was speaking on mute, so I'm going to let him talk too. But if we're all projecting this seeming reality, it must be a part of the mind as well. If it's an outward expansion, that's what I'm hearing from you. So by addressing it, by focusing on it, that's a really beautiful kind of integrative way of looking at it. So thank you for articulating it. I'm glad it's polishing your own mirror, you selfish man.
Yeah.
And even, Sri Ramana never said go off and be detached. The one of the most kind of stereotypical gurus to me in external factors, at least. Man sitting on the top of a hill in silence, people come to him. That is the guru image. And he never said, go off into the Himalayas and disappear. He always said it was in the mind. It was detaching from your own suffering, detaching from your own attachments to things in the world, do the work in the world. Even the kind of most Advaitist of them all suggested social action, and the Gita talks about this. So I'm loving this, Sitaram. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, and even that the joke that was just made, right, about me being selfish, right, because of the way I'm framing it, but there's actually really deep truth in that, because essentially from my readings of the teachings, what they're saying is that our deepest wants, what our heart wants deeply, is to live in alignment with our values. Like, we don't want to be causing pain and suffering to other people. Like, that deeper fulfillment, like, that's what we want. And so as we grow in wisdom is the realization that we're all connected. Essentially what we're doing is we're dropping away these false views that allow what we normally think of as selfish tendencies of mind, that allow those to flourish. Those exist too. I mean, it's a part of the human shadow, but that deeper want that's rooted in the essence of consciousness itself, it wants to serve. Love, serve, remember. Those are instructions from our own heart. It's not some should that we have to layer on top of ourselves from some external teaching. There's a reason why those teachings feel intuitively right to us. If that's coming from our own selves, we're essentially just, oh, right, I know that that's true, right? It's not because it's some magical formula that we were able to prove intellectually, or we know that that's true, to love everyone, to serve everyone, to remember God, or to remember the truth, or to remember to even do that, right? As this recipe for life. And so as we grow on the path, this is what I've really found for myself. There's this startling realization that we really can trust ourselves. Yeah, as we start to unravel enough, we get a little bit of clarity and quiet so that we can listen a little bit more deeply. We realize that we really can trust ourselves, and that includes trusting our own desire systems. Yeah, and that's been something that I've been really sitting with lately. Just that sense of self trust on the path.
It's beautiful.
Instead of constant self-doubt.
Instead of ego voice. Relevant to that, I just wanted to add this one thing. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm stepping over my panelists here, but I'm just on fire right now. One thing that I was sharing with a friend recently was that, to your point of it's coming from the self, this idea in Western religion and institutional exoteric religion that we're dirty, we're originally sinful, thanks Augustine, and just that whole fear-based religious instrument. The reason it's wrong is because when I sit very still and breathe very deeply, I feel love, I feel peace, I feel calmness. And if I was inherently dirty or evil, if I got more connected with myself, it would be the opposite. It would be painful to connect with my dirty innards. But no, what a relief to, understand that, by quieting everything else, all the surface level stuff, digging really, really deeply, all of that other stuff falls away, and you can really tap into, what you're talking about, that love, that sense of connectivity and harmony with yourself and with others. It's accessible.
Yeah. And that part of ourselves, right, that's dirty, as you say, that does exist too. It's just not the deepest part of ourselves. And it's another element too. As we grow on the path, we start to learn that we don't have to be afraid of that part of ourselves either. Sometimes we think about love almost like it's this soft blanket that we can use to cover up the parts of ourselves or the parts of the experience deeply uncomfortable or that we're grossed out by. But what I've found, and this comes back to the sense of trust, that's not actually what love is. Love is that deeper capacity in our being that can actually just be present with the totality of what it means to be human. And that includes my selfish tendencies of mine. That includes the fact that even though I'm talking about service in this very kind of enlightened view, I know that I have selfish tendencies of mine, that there's a part of me, also being a creative. Tell me if anyone hasn't experienced this, right? My act of wanting to create and to be a part of that creative process, I know that that's pure. And I simultaneously know that there's all sorts of parts of my being that are constantly trying to co-opt it, right? Like, I just know that creation is just definitely a part of how I exist in the world, and that's a pure act. And there's parts of me that, really have these strong desires to be seen and appreciated and loved and are constantly trying to co-opt these things. And that exists either in service work or whatever, right? That those selfish tendencies of mine, as we normally call them, that exists in me, and it has never gone away, and it's always present in every moment, essentially. But as with these practices, I get to hold that in a deeper way, and it doesn't have to be driving the show so much. And that also points me back to the sense of trust, is that I can trust that I'm on this path and I'm doing the best that I can, even though I have these parts of myself that are constantly trying to co-opt things, or that have these other agendas in there, right? And I've yet to get rid of those things, but I've found that as I acknowledge them and hold them in a different way, they don't have to drive the ship so much.
You can learn to love them.
Exactly. Yeah. I can
I
even
love
love
it.
my self-hatred and my self-criticism. Yeah. Because love doesn't mean pushing that away either. That's just a part of the
Exactly.
mind that does that. It criticizes everything, that judges everything. I can hold that in loving awareness too. And that can just be one other voice that exists. It doesn't have to be my deepest voice. I don't have to give it added extra weight. And I can love it just because it exists, right?
We and I just talked about that.
I'm
That's why I'm
smiling right
laughing.
now. I know. I know. I've also been fairly quiet. I don't know. I hope you all can hear me, but I've been having a really hard time with my connection.
Oh,
Okay,
bummer.
I didn't want to
Yeah,
throw
we can
everyone
hear you,
off
okay?
by talking. Okay,
You're good.
awesome. No, I mean, Bob and I were just speaking about that today, just loving all of our parts, no matter the ones that I'm perceiving as a bad part, quote unquote. So, struggling, for example, with anxiety and befriending that anxiety as a part of myself that ultimately is there to protect me, or at least trying to protect me in some way, and loving it and accepting it, because the more I resist it, of course, the more amplified it is. And by loving it and accepting it, it's almost not running the show nearly as much. I respect it as a part of me, but to your point, it's not leading my life 24/7.
Yeah. Well, and I love you pointing out that even something like anxiety, which we normally think of as a bad thing, that it even serves a positive purpose. And I experienced this just before coming on this podcast. I still, before any kirtan or any podcast or any time where I have to be on, right, whatever, there's a part of me that feels a little bit of nervousness right before, okay? But what I've learned over time is that that doesn't have to be a bad thing, and that I don't have to have any story about it. I can just experience it. And what is that doing really? Well, it's kicking up my mind is becoming more alert, right? All these things are happening that are positive things. If I'm spun out and I'm caught up in that nervousness, then yeah, then that can be a detriment. But if I just allow myself to be present with it, not only does it have to not get in the way, but oftentimes it can be an aid. It can be a helpful tool. And so,
Exactly.
yeah, this sense of not pushing anything away, and it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing, right? I mean, for people listening, you don't have to totally believe me. It's just, we just believe it enough to be willing to try it out. And what happens is our life, we find more and more areas where, yeah, being present with whatever's going on, it doesn't have to be so terrifying, and it can actually be very valid and inherently enlivening.
Mm.
I'm not there yet, but Byron Katie has had a line. This is just the point of the episode where I mentioned Byron Katie, because I bring her up every time. She said something like, someone said, "Do you get nervous before things?" And she says, "Oh no, what could there be to be concerned about how others perceive me? Like that doesn't, how could I ever, I don't know. I think that." I feel like that is real. Like I do, I do believe that there are very, very, what are they, Jivan Muktas? I think there are very high beings that are, essentially free of that kind of voice. But I think that, what you guys are talking about is absolutely the way there, the way to get, even Ram Dass's famous line about the neuroses, right? And how they're not, I haven't got rid of one neuroses at 25 years of meditating and doing yoga, but now they're little goblins. And now I say, hey, anxiety, hey, sexual perversion, haven't seen you in a while, how are you doing? Loving that aspect of self. I think that is the way there, but I couldn't help but mention my my queen.
Yeah. And I hear that, and I definitely, as we relate to things differently, these innate physiological responses are going to be activated in different ways. I do have a hard time believing, though, that Byron Katie has never experienced nervousness. She might just relate to it in a different way. Here's an interesting little story. Jack Kornfield shared this at a Ram Dass Beach Day. Every Monday, Ram Dass loved swimming, right? Because in his stroke, he couldn't be mobile, and so in the water it was this chance of freedom, and he had to have life preservers and all these things, but he could control his own body and move around, right? And so we would all gather on Mondays, and on this particular day, Jack Kornfield was there, and he talked about an experience he had where he recently had a health scare, and essentially he thought that he was dying, and he felt terror in his body. He was afraid to die. And after this health scare, his first thought was, man, I guess I failed the test, right? And we hear this a lot, But then he said he was reflecting on it more after that and came to the conclusion, well, I guess I really didn't. Like, the body and the mind is afraid to die. That's what they do. And what these awareness practices are about are not identifying that and just being present with whatever's going on. Another story that brings to mind is Suzuki Roshi, right? Well-known Zen teacher. He was talking to his Zen students, and they asked him, what do you think it's going to be like when you die? And there was this assumption there that he was going to have this peaceful death. And so his response was, I don't know, maybe I'll die like this. And he started screaming and kicking around his arms and legs, right? Because what are we really talking about? I mean, if we're not identified with this body-mind system, then why isn't that a valid? Why is that a less conscious way to die, for instance? I mean, these kind of stories, I think they can really flip our mind about what we're talking about when we're talking about the spiritual path, and when we talk about disidentifying with who we think we are, what that really means. So I'm constantly finding that the ideas I used to have, even a couple years ago, a couple months ago, about what it means to live on the spiritual path, I'm constantly learning that those aren't necessarily as valid as I thought they were. I'm constantly learning that whatever little spiritual awakenings I've had, that a lot of these ideas, these idealizations, they're kind of extrapolations from that, and a lot of those extrapolations have a lot of dominant cultural thinking intertwined in them that I just wasn't able to see. So I'm constantly being stripped away to just this. I have no idea what a more advanced stage on the spiritual path looks like. I just don't know anymore.
Well, and that really comes across, Sitaram, in your writing. I really wanted to read this piece from Radical Unknowing, which is essentially what you're alluding to, which I really enjoyed. You said, a dear friend recently told me that he didn't like the word intuition. I think its meaning has been diluted, he said. I can relate to this. We often see it as some sort of character trait that we possess, a superpower immune from the checks and balances of logic, reason, and evidence. Where I live in the rural redwoods of Northern California, there is a community member who is convinced that certain drum rhythms, especially the rhythms used in reggae, hip-hop, and pop music, are of a lower vibration. Because he is so sensitive and intuitive, he can feel his energy drain just being around these sounds, and he's even gotten sick from it. I once told him that I did not have the same experience that he did, and his response was that I was not evolved enough to notice. He claimed it was because I was an intellectual. He proselytizes others so they too can awaken to these rhythms' disharmonious nature. For him, ridding the world of this evil sound is a key part of achieving world peace. This may seem like an extreme example, but I think many of us do this in less obvious ways. In my counseling work with people, I've found that a major obstacle to receiving new information is when an, quote, intuitive person has access to otherworldly knowledge. When someone knows something, it shuts off the possibility of being wrong. This is true regardless of where the information comes from, but intuitive knowledge often seems especially immune from correction. Instead of shaping and redirecting our inner compass to better fit reality, we create a list of justifications and beliefs to maintain our intuitive identity. This creates a mental wall that keeps us trapped in our own projections, imaginations, thought constructs, and isolated worlds. We stop listening. Really, really sharp, man. I mean, I think we've all, what you're kind of calling out to me in that piece is, aspects of the spiritual dumb, where there's so many, folks are carrying so much into every new moment, that it's really restrictive. It's really restrictive, and it takes constant analysis to stay open. So I just love that.
Yeah, one of the things, part of my opening into the spiritual path was really exploring the worldview of agnosticism to its edges, right? So that's essentially what my stance was. I don't know. I don't know if there's a God. I don't know. But also with that, I was very rooted in a scientific, materialistic view of the world, right? And so taking that sense of not knowing, of agnosticism, to its edges meant that I started to get to this place where I saw that even the tenets of logical thinking, I'm not saying I disagree with that, I find great value in it, but that those basic tenets, essentially at some point you're taking that worldview on faith. And that started to open up me to this realm where, with the aid of psychedelics and other practices, I started to just actively explore and take on different worldviews, as a core spiritual practice. And what's interesting is to really take on a worldview, you have to be caught in it. I mean, otherwise you're just reading about it. And so this meant, in terms of like smoking lots of pot and reading conspiracy theories and really getting in them and seeing the world from those perspectives. At that time, when I was in my early 20s, the big conspiracy theory, had to do with like 9/11 and all these things. And right, this idea that it was this plot orchestrated by inside of the US government, and living in that reality for a while and seeing it and seeing all the feelings of paranoia I had and all these things, but also seeing that once I was in that worldview, all the evidence seemed to point to it, right? And eventually it started to crack when I started to, again, just challenge the fact that even if there are unknowns about what happened, right, how many assumptions are there between those unknowns and forming a worldview around it? So experimenting with that and experimenting with spiritual worldviews, which is really interesting because in spiritual worldviews, these are generally speaking both untestable and untested views of reality, right? These aren't things that, we can't do some science experiment to prove or disprove most core spiritual frameworks. So we start to form a different orientation around these things where I found, rather than thinking about it, if it's true or false, especially for things that are untested and untestable, it seems to me that it's much more skillful to view them in terms of, is this a helpful view of reality? Is this serving me in some way? Right? And so I carried this worldview for a long time. And that kind of core agnosticism is still very rooted in me because the truth is it has served me really well. But what I've started to find also on the flip side of this is that we don't just benefit from different worldviews, but worldviews have side effects as well. And that's been a really interesting thing. And all of us have core worldviews. And that some of these worldviews are so deeply rooted that they're not like costumes that we can just switch out at bay, right? They're so deeply rooted that not only do we have a hard time seeing it, but when we interact with people around us, they're not even really able to mirror this worldview for us because they're caught in the same worldview. When we really talk about how deep our individualistic, materialistic culture is, right? And so we're all caught in these worldviews. And that's part of the reason why using this critical reasoning and this lens, to me, once I started to gain insight that was important on my own spiritual path, then all of a sudden I could see that actually all these spiritual traditions talk about how important it really is as a protective factor on the path. And, that piece I wrote that long before QAnon and all these modern day, where it's just so obvious how caught in worldview we can be. But, what I think is really important about it is that we are also just as caught in worldviews, and ours might not be as obvious or ridiculous But we all have these core assumptions about reality that we have not looked at yet. And so intuition is key to the spiritual path. The ability to trust ourselves is key. And doubt is a mechanism of the mind that exists for a reason. I'm always going to be very cautious around people that are a little bit too confident. And as far as I can tell, the people that are really in touch of their intuition, it's because they're willing to be very comfortable with that discomfort of not knowing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah, willing to question their own intuition and themselves.
Yeah.
In every moment, yeah.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. I'm honestly.
Oh, Melina, you got your audio muted.
I was saying that is so beautiful that I'm actually speechless. So, as I have been this entire podcast, but that was so beautiful. I feel
yeah,
emotional.
it was very powerful.
Right on.
I feel compelled, one thing you mentioned about the beliefs of others and they're caught and we're caught, and not in an attempt to redeem my earlier Byron Katie comment, but she did say this also, which was, people making bombs. There are people making bombs right now. They have the intention to blow them up and hurt people. If you believed what they believed, wouldn't you be building bombs right now? Really what that does to me, what you're describing, is create an immense level of empathy and compassion. And it doesn't mean we condone it. You actually wrote something similar. I'm kind of remembering. You wrote a similar piece in your essays as well about, people who commit abuse. Well, they're typically abused. There's this whole cycle and this generational wheel that's spinning. And so we don't condone the actions, but to the Neem Karoli Baba, paraphrasing Kabir, what is it? Do what you will with another person, but never put them out of your heart. Yeah. It seems like, what you're talking about, and kind of the theme of so much to do with Ram Dass and just the Kripa scene, is love. And loving others and loving ourselves, kind of despite all of these trappings and flaws and all the above.
Yeah. It's interesting with those teachings. So I've been on both sides of this in my life, in my social work career, where I've done mental health counseling to people that were born where they experienced trauma because the state essentially took their father, usually, out of the home and put them in prison, right? And I can see the effect that had on that person. And simultaneously, I've worked in communities where this is happening at disproportionate rates. And you can see what happens to the entire community when large numbers of family systems get disrupted like that, right? So I know deeply that our current prison system doesn't work and it's not serving people. And I've also had the experience of working with people in domestic abuse situations where my work with them is counseling them so they can have the strength, so they can go to court and they can testify against their abuser so that person goes to prison, because that's the only way that they're ever going to feel safe in this world. I've had that experience too. And so, when we talk about these teachings are so profound because they exist on all levels. When we see them on paper, do what you do with another person, but don't put them out of your heart, that kind of sounds very romantic. In a sense, I think it's supposed to, because it's supposed to inspire us. But when we're really down in the nitty gritty of it, it can be so painful, that reality, of course, that person needs to feel safe. And in our current system, that means that this person needs to go into our current prison industrial complex. And what that person did is not okay, and it shouldn't be allowed. And this person has a right to feel safe, right? And that's not going to be possible if that person's not behind bars. And I know what that person going to prison is going to do in terms of also perpetuating family dynamics and perpetuating systemic violence down the line. So these kind of teachings really do take us into just a very core and fragile level of reality that it doesn't feel comforting, but I think that it can inspire the type of action and way to be in the world that can actually make some type of significant change.
The intimacy on both sides, and almost kind of the dualistic nature, right? You know, this person ought to go into this broken system to make this person feel safe, and yet at the same time, this system is so broken and so clunky and terrible. But I think there's even another, you know, almost like that's what the counter to that is the domestic abuser going to prison. But the other counter is, you know, and I think, you know, I feel like I might have seen something you guys wrote about it, or I know Ram Dass wrote about people in solitary that have awakening experiences because they finally had a minute to breathe. And, you know, I'm in complete alignment with you politically in the, you know, injustices of the system and the inhumanity. Frankly, it's you know, it really is treating people as less than, and it's disgusting in many ways. And I got to see that with my own eyes. But at the same time, the individual that's open, you know, I mean, I know a guy, Scott and Ryan and I filmed this movie where this guy, Richie, became a yoga master in prison and found a yoga book. And, you know, there was a community yoga. Austin CYA went into the prisons and taught yoga. And he said, I got more free there than out here. Now I got to worry about bills and food and everything else. And I can't get a job. You know, that's another effect of the system, is that these guys are completely lacking in their economic opportunities. But at the same time, it was such a transformative, granted there was great suffering, but it was such a transformative experience for him because he was open to it. It was his karmic moment, or, you know, whatever the formula is. That can work for people too. So it's, I don't know, being open to all of that.
Well, I've had this experience so many times where, you know, it's going to be a specific type of person. Well, there's going to be various specific types of people that are going to come to a kirtan at a prison. So some of the things that people might not be aware of is that generally, if you're going to go to something like that, you're giving something up. And it might be you're giving up your nightly phone call or your shower, right? You only get so much free time. So this is a big choice, right, that's being made to come to an event like that. And so there's obviously going to be people that are hungry on all different levels for the teachings, just like I'm hungry for the teachings. But I'm always struck there continuously. I come in contact either through letter writing or through the kirtans or through other work I've done in prisons with people that have done way more healing work and are way more in touch with themselves than the vast majority of people that I meet on the outside. And it's incredible, you know, when you come in contact with that. And for me, that the right response to that is then to question, like, why are you there? You know, like what good is this like what social good is this doing, right? And for myself, I want to always come down to a feeling of awe and amazement that that's possible, that people can do that work in those conditions. Because the truth is, the vast majority of people that go to solitary, it just deepens their trauma. You know, it's for the vast majority of people who go into prison, I mean, they're dealing with sexualized violence, physical violence. You know, it is not a place that's meant for healing. And so it is incredible that there's various people, you know, their karmic conditions are ripe, that they can do that work. And coming back to this idea of sacred community, what made that possible? What made that possible was service-minded people making sure that they had some access to the teaching, some access to the practices, right? And that person that you talked about that came out of that prison, how much more could he deepen all of that if also there was a better safety net for him to come into, right? So we can be awakened through all sorts of things. Trauma is so many people can be awakened through trauma. People are awakened through near-death experiences. That's true. And that is a part of just this mysterious nature of reality. And at the same time, we are led to believe that it is a part of our job to limit suffering where we can. And especially if it's suffering that is human caused in the first place, that seems like a good place to start.
You're here.
Yeah,
Really,
seems
really
like it'll
be powerful.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ryan.
I just to say, really, really powerful points of view. I really appreciate you sharing your experiences in the prisons, and yeah, it's really beautiful stuff.
Yeah. Same.
I just have one thought that I really do want to get out there, and it's been sitting on me. But to your point about part of our job is to eliminate some of the suffering, especially ones that are coming from human tendencies, it does bring me to the idea that we started this conversation on with dependency and the beauty behind codependency, in order to that community, the sacred community piece, and then the big abstract line of what society, at least in the Western culture, is, and how we push for individualistic success, productivity, and it's just to see that vast difference and see how that is us creating our own suffering as well by buying into these thoughts, these predisposed storylines and ways of living that are perceptions that people before us created. I just can't help but just verbalize that, and it's literally hitting us in the face,
Yeah, absolutely, right. And that, when we talk about this kind of service work we're talking about, that's why I started saying it's really for me, right? Because if we need each other, then I'm led to believe that me lending a hand, doing my part, that's going to change my being, just as it's going to potentially enable someone else to change their being. And the sense, right, we talked about community and trust earlier. There's also this sense that the more I lean into interdependence, the more I recognize that I haven't gained one thing on the spiritual path without someone else, right? Even having access to a teaching, it's because someone said it, someone wrote it down, someone put it in a book, someone donated it to a library, whatever, right? And I'm going to need more help down the line. That's just a fact. I know that. There's going to be times in my life when I'm going to need immense amount of help from other people. And so there's also this sense of trust too. Like,
Yeah.
that feels really scary. Can I trust that community is going to hold me up when I need it? And that just feels also like a more real and vulnerable and humble way to be in the world, and also to serve from.
Yeah, I agree. I think the disheartening thing to me about modern society is, to Melina's point, the individualistic, materialistic, consumerist tendencies. We're pedal to the metal on products and trash in the oceans and all these things, because people think that the external forms like that will make them happy. And they just haven't figured it out yet. Does it give temporary happiness? Of course, fleeting. And it's the Tesla must control real well. There's some joy in the external stimuli. That's why it's so alluring. But it runs out, and it isn't ultimately, that deeper sense of bliss that you experience when you're doing these practices, which include service, which include helping other people. I'm optimistic. I like to be optimistic about the fact that, it's kind of like, if I've put that together, then anybody can. I've seen through an aspect of the futility of the external, with the help, to your point, with the help of Yogananda and the Buddha and the Gospel of Thomas and and Ram Dass, of course, and so many. But if I've seen through it, then It's got to be pretty obvious, guys.
Yeah. That's well said. Yeah. Because there's an element of it that's nothing special, right? I mean, sometimes I think back on, there's this one distinct moment, and I don't know anymore if my mind has just melded multiple moments into this one moment, but I kind of remember this time, 7 or 8.
Useful disclaimer.
I was about 7 or 8 and laying in bed and falling asleep and essentially not having any thoughts, or the space between thoughts was big enough that there was just this felt sense of the mystery of experience, right? And I had no words for it, but that visceral felt experience of being alive, I remember that. I remember being touched by it in a different way and not even knowing there was something to talk about, right? And now I have much more language and practices, and I've read all these spiritual texts, and there's all sorts of belief systems I can put around it and languages I can use. But essentially, it's no different. What I'm talking about or touching upon today is that felt experience when I was about 7 or 8. And I just know that all of us have touched that place in our being because it's who we are. And we've all had moments where we've had momentary awarenesses of that. And so yeah, there's this element of it that is, it's nothing special. That's why we say we have these teachings like it's our birthright, right? Because it's who we are. It's the state of being alive. Yeah. And there's a reason why not only is it this root awareness we have, but also that we all kind of intuitively know and agree that it's our highest value, right? Whether we're calling it love or truth, right? There's this universal sense of that. And that does give me a sense of hope, you know? It's a hope that's mediated by a lot of factors and global climate change. And, you know, I want to have a hope that's based in realism, but also I think you're right too, that, you know,
But also the real.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that.
Capital R.
Yeah. Realism. Yeah. Hope rooted in realism and the real. That's good. Yeah. That's good.
Any questions, gang, before I read more of my favorite book? This is pretty close to what you just said. Beliefs masquerading as truth. Truth is that which can stand on its own. It needs no support. There's no amount of evidence or reasoning that can either prove or disprove truth. We often call this type of knowing faith. But there is quite a bit of confusion about faith. Faith comes from the heart. It cannot be found in the mind. This misunderstanding has pushed many into increasingly blind, rigid, and unhealthy viewpoints. By taking a thought and clinging to it against all evidence and reason, it traps us in the prison of our own limited perspective. It cuts off all possibility for healthy discussion. It makes many feel that their religion is the only one, and blindly leads millions to challenge the findings of science. This has made many agnostics and atheists skeptical of the role of faith in today's world. Faith is not a belief that we hold to tightly. When our beliefs are misplaced as faith, we feel the need to squeeze them as if we are trying to compress a fleeting sand into a solid rock. This squeezing may create the illusion of solidity, but it requires effort to continue the charade. The second we stop holding, it crumbles. Faith requires none of that. It takes no energy or holding. Truth just is. It is found through the continual letting go of clinging in the mind. Could keep going, but point made.
Yeah. I love the way you put that. I've noticed that a lot. I see versions of faith that feel very fragile, because people are trying to defend it with proof, and it's just it reveals how fragile it is to them, because they feel threatened by, you know, whatever feels threatening at the moment, whether it's science or another group of people who believe something different, or it just feels very fragile when people try to
Kind of fear-based.
fear. Yeah, it's kind of sad to to witness, and also scary to witness sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that's one of the things that's changed for me, right? In the beginnings of the path, I would mistake people that seemed really confident. I would mistake that as them, they really know, right? But now I see a mature faith I find it in people that are just very comfortable with doubt, right? Because if our faith or trust, to use a different word, if it's strong enough, then we know that doubt, if our faith is really rooted in reality, then what is doubt going to do to dissuade that or take that away, right? Because doubt, it's an important mechanism of the mind. And I found for myself, the more that I can inspect even my deepest spiritual beliefs, the more I can see, are those really serving me or not, like anymore? And maybe a certain belief served me a couple years ago, and it did truly orient me towards that deeper, ineffable faith at that time. But maybe now there's elements of that belief that maybe need to be edited or readjusted because maybe it's not really serving me anymore. And yeah, and if I'm too attached, if I start to notice that clinging, that's become more and more of a sign for myself, like, oh, I need to take a look at this, because faith should be rooted in freedom. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I like that.
Continually re-examining.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sitaram, tell us some books that we should read besides yours.
Wow.
Just a handful. I know you could probably recommend 31.
Well, I will start with one of my favorite books that is a little bit lesser known from my teacher, Ram Dass. Most people are aware of Be Here Now, and that is an exquisite and beautiful book. But one of the books that really opened my heart in the last, I guess it was about a decade ago now when it was written, is the book Be Love Now. And that book didn't get as much necessarily mainstream traction, but it is an exquisite book. It's really it captures the full evolution of his teachings in terms of bringing in loving awareness into the present moment awareness. And it's an exquisite book. I love it. Even I'll turn to it again and again, even just those first opening pages, where essentially he talks about, just imagine that we are loved totally and completely just the way we are, just for existing. And it's just paragraph after paragraph of really, deepening that awareness. And so that's an exquisite book. And I would say anything by Mirabai Starr. She's an author that one, she's a friend and an elder, and I consider her to be a mentor in a lot of ways. I really look up to her. But she's someone that I feel like what inspires me about her is she has what I see as that mature faith, where she's very comfortable with doubt. And she also writes exquisitely. Anything by her. She's done a lot of translations of a lot of the Christian mystics, including St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila. And then she has some more recent books that have come out from her own voice as well. So anything by her. And the Bhagavad Gita, you brought that up. I can share another little story. In my first private one-on-one meeting with Ram Dass, I was there, and it was beautiful. It was just a beautiful, exquisite moment in time for me that's forever just burned in my being. And we had this long pause, and we just went to all these different states of consciousness together, and then we're in this more verbal space, and kind of out of nowhere, he just said, it's good to read spiritual books. And I got real flustered because it really brought up all this stuff for me. And I was like, really? Because I'm constantly reading spiritual books and I feel like I should be meditating instead. And sometimes I think it's just an escape and that, you know,
I've read all of them already.
I'm like really spinning out, you know, like, and there's an element of it that's true for me. You know, I have this really strong inquisitive mind that likes to be engaged with things, and engaging in contemplative sit down practices is good for me, right? To loosen that hold. So I'm really neurotic about that. And he just kind of stops me. He says it again. He says, read spiritual books. And that was also a part of me recognizing that I didn't have to fight myself either on the spiritual path. Like I have these innate characteristics of being, you know, I love playing music, so that can be a part of my spiritual path. I love reading. I'm a voracious reader. I've always written. You know, the creative process can be a part of my spiritual path. These things don't have to be separate, right? But the other thing he said in that meeting is he said, you should read the Bhagavad Gita. And my first response, this is real, this is what I said. I said, oh, I've already read that. And he said, you should read it again. So now I own, I think, 7 or 8 different copies of it, all different translations. You know, I now see it as a lifelong study. So I would recommend that for anyone. Ram Dass's book, his reader on the Bhagavad Gita is really great. Kind of companion guide to it, Path to God.
Yogananda's Can't Help But Mention God Talks to Arjuna is terrific and voluminous. I mean, yeah. I don't think I've got A through Z with it. I kind of look up a passage and read the 10 pages on each line, you know, that kind of commentary.
Wow.
I've forgotten about that book. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just add to your list.
Yeah.
We're all open friends here.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Will you, Sitaram?
9?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you need another one. Will you tell just briefly, kind of before you take us out, before we depart for the evening, Sitaram, will you tell us that story about the hitchhiker? Because when you said the Bhagavad Gita and Ram Dass, I thought of your little story about the Ramayana.
Sure. Yeah, I'll tell that story. And then before we go, if I can just make a couple plugs about our...
Please. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Tell everything.
Cool.
Tell everybody.
Yeah. So it was... I hadn't been living at the house for that long, maybe a few months. And a bunch of people had come to Maui that were all with Neem Karoli Baba, Ram Dass's guru, the saint that he was with in the late 60s and early 70s. And they were all on island because it was just it was a family get together of their satsang to celebrate that it had been 40 years since Be Here Now came out. And for them, it was really a celebration of their time with Maharaji together. And I got to be there as Ram Dass's caregiver, and that was really cool for me. So, you know, Raghu Marcus, who's the head of Love Serve Remember Foundation, Krishnadas was there. Parvati Marcus, who wrote the book Love Everyone, was there. I mean, all sorts of just really amazing people were there. And then also KK Saw was there. KK is an Indian devotee who became really close friends and family with all the Westerners that were there because he was their translator, and also because Maharaji instructed him to take care of them, and he took that to heart. And so, you know, the family bond was really tight. And so a lot of people are there on island, and I got to have all these cool conversations with a lot of people. 2 of those conversations are important to the story. One is that KK was there, and I really wanted to talk to him. I'm actually remembering something right now that I have not remembered this part of the story in a really long time, nor did I write about this in the book. I wanted to talk to KK, but he was really quiet. He was not a talkative person, but I did see that like someone came because they wanted to seek advice from another person on Maui. Basically, they wanted to have his darshan, you know, like a private one-on-one spiritual meeting with him. And they spent like an hour together. And I was like, what? This person who I basically don't see talking at all. And I remember talking to Ram Dass about it and just saying, I'd love to talk to KK, but I don't know what about. And also I brought to Ram Dass's mind, tied to the Bhagavad Gita, that this one translation I had, it talked about how basically if you did bad things, you went to hell. And I was like, this doesn't seem to resonate with me. Like, what are they talking about with hell? And Ram Dass said, oh, you should ask KK. He's a scholar of the Gita and also the Ramayana. You should ask him about that. And that would be a way that you can talk to him. I was like, okay. So I found a moment when KK was all alone, and I brought him this question, and he just pulled out, he knew the exact page that the answer that my question was from the Ramayana, where basically he talks about, essentially in the Hindu model, hell is not some eternal place. There's different levels of consciousness, and they all have essentially different amounts of suffering in them, and it has to do with our karma, and ultimately we're all on this spiritual journey to God. And I was like, okay, that makes sense to me. But in that meeting,
spiral staircase of levels. Okay, I got it.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't satisfied with this idea that there was potentially some eternal hell that people burn in, right? This Western model. And that was the word they used in that translation. It didn't say eternal, but that word hell has a lot of connotations that wasn't necessarily meant to be there. But he also said something to me. He said, you should really read the Tulsidas Ramayana. There's many versions of the Ramayana. Valmiki wrote the first one, at least in written form. But the Tulsidas Ramayana was really popular around the area where Maharaji named Kurli Baba lived, because it was written in Avidhi, a dialect of Hindi. It wasn't written in Sanskrit. It was written so that common people could know the story and understand it. And so in our satsang, that's kind of become a primary text or version of the Ramayana. And that is the version that KK was a scholar of. So he told me I should read it. He said, Ram Dass has multiple copies of it. I'm sure he would loan you one. He knew Ram Dass had multiple copies of it because every time KK came to visit Ram Dass, he would give him a copy of it. Which is a beautiful, exquisite kind of element of their long-standing relationship. So I start reading that, and in the process, I found really quickly that, especially in the way Tulsidas writes it, it wasn't just about the story. I mean, I'd read kind of modern abridged versions of the Ramayana. I knew the basic story of Hanuman and Ram and Sita. But those abridged versions, they're small, like modern book form. And this is a fat book. And why is it so fat? Well, there's just page after page of essentially devotional poetry describing everything. And it's so over the top and so flowery. And at some point, something cracked, and I got to be in this devotional mood that he was writing in. And I saw, he's not just telling a story. Yes, the story is important, but he's also using the story as a vehicle to essentially invite us into the bhav, into the devotional mood. So I started reading it really slowly. I wanted to savor it. I wanted to only read it when I could be in that bhav with Tulsidas. So that's one of the things that happened. The other thing is that Krishnadas was there. And at that point in time, I worshipped him. He was the first big kirtan I had ever been in. He was the person that inspired me to buy my harmonium, so I was definitely, it was hard for me to act natural around him. We'll just say that, I was trying to act, I'm going to be cool. I'm going to be cool around Krishnadas. And we were talking at some point, and he said, yeah, you should just chant 108 Hanuman Chalisas. For people listening who don't know, Hanuman Chalisa, rather than being call and response chanting, it is this about a 7-minute long 40-verse prayer to Lord Hanuman. And it was a chant that I had learned at that point because it was really important to Ram Dass and to the satsang around Maharaji. He's like, yeah, you should just chant 108 of them. And he said it so casually. And I was like, chant 108? I had never heard of this before. He's like, yeah, it's fine. It doesn't have to be a big deal. You light a candle. He said, you're allowed to take bathroom breaks. You can drink coffee. And he said, and you don't have to sing all of them. If you want, you can read some of them. That was the extent of my instruction. That's what he told me. I was like, okay. So then everyone leaves the island. I have this practice. I'm reading the Ramayana every night before bed. And Krishnadas told me I should chant 108 Hanuman Chalisas. So at that point in time, I got one day off a week where it wasn't like I was doing stuff all the time, but, I needed to be around to help with things. And there was one day where, if help needed to be had, someone else was going to do that help, right? I had this one day off. So I decided to take my day off on a Tuesday, which is said to be Hanuman's day. And I sat down at the edge of the property. I had this makeshift temple that I'd built out of tarps and this canopy structure, and I would chant. And so I sat down and do my 108 Hanuman Chalisas, and it took about 8 hours in total. And at that point in time, chanting was so powerful for me. It blasted me into bliss realms like every single time. And even though I knew that the teachings say that it's not actually about what we feel, right? Feelings are secondary. I mean, if we feel good, that's meant to be enjoyed, but that's not what we're chasing after with practice, right? We're talking about something deeper than feeling. And even though I knew that, because chanting always brought me into those bliss realms, I kind of had this idea that if I was chanting all day, who knows what would happen? It would just completely annihilate me, in the sun or something like that. And that's not what happened. What happened was I had a lot of body pain and I experienced boredom, which I had never really experienced boredom chanting before. And I was chanting a lot. So that was a new thing for me. And so fatigue, boredom, body pain, frustration, having to use the will a little bit more to stay with the practice. This is very interesting. It was very new for me, for that practice. I had done extended meditation sits, but for chanting, it had never been like that. So I was a little bit confused about it, even though I felt like I shouldn't be, because I knew the teachings say that it's just about the practice and yada, yada, yada. So that's what's going through my mind. And then Krishnadas calls the very next day. He didn't call the house all that often. And I didn't pick up the phone all that often because if Dasima was there, she would answer it. Well, at that point in time, Dasima and Ramdas were both gone. The phone rang, so I answered the phone. And Krishnadas happened to be calling just to check in to see how Ramdas was doing, which he didn't do all that often. I will say, in the 3 years I was on Maui, that was the only time I ever answered the phone to have Krishnadas on the other line. So I told Krishnadas, hey, I just chanted 108 Hanuman Chalisas yesterday. It's kind of weird that you're calling right now. He said, it's not weird at all. That's how Maharaji works. Krishnadas is kind of gruff with those things. So he said it like that. And I was like, oh, yeah, right. And he said, well, how'd it go? And so I sheepishly told him the whole extent of my experience and my struggles. And his response was good. It's good. We want the immediate hit, but these practices work on us over lifetimes. He said, Maharaji used to have us go and chant all day, sometimes for 10 hours at a time. We would go through all those states. And what it did is it worked on us. It gave us a different relationship to the practice. I was like, okay. So when I got off that phone, I knew that there was more work for me with that practice. And so I decided to dedicate the next few Tuesdays, my one day off a week, to doing that practice. So for the next month, so 4 total, I did 108 Hanuman Chalisas. During that same time, I'm also reading the Ramayana every night. And the Ramayana is the text that the Hanuman Chalisa draws from. They're essentially telling the same story. The Hanuman Chalisa is specifically about Hanuman, a being that exemplifies perfect service and devotion to God. And he's one of the characters from the Ramayana. So I'm doing these 2 practices simultaneously, and never should go without saying that Hanuman was definitely on my mind, and I was seeing him everywhere. And sometimes I'd look at the clouds and I would see Hanuman in the clouds, that kind of thing. It wasn't anything that was worth writing home about, except that it was profound for me because I was just very saturated in Hanuman. But this one event happened towards the end of the month that I will always remember. I picked up a hitchhiker at Mana Foods, which is a health food store, this tiny little health food store on the north shore of Maui, in this town called Paia. And I picked up this hitchhiker there, and he needed a ride out to an area that it's known as Twin Falls, which is fairly close to Ramdas's home. And so I agreed to give him a ride. And he got in my car and he immediately noticed I had on my dashboard a picture of Ram and Hanuman hugging. Ram in the text is said to be an incarnation of God on earth in the form of a king that was exiled out of his kingdom and had to be banished in the forest for 14 years. And that's all part of the Leela of the story. So this hitchhiker I see sees this picture and he gets so excited. He starts talking about Hanuman. I'm like, oh, wow, what great luck. And so I'm talking about Hanuman with him, and we're talking about Hanuman, and we're driving, and it comes time to drop him off. And he looks at me, and he looked right in my eyes. You know, sometimes when people are going to say something really profound, they look at you and they have this certain look, and they talk in this voice, and it's their profound voice, and it leads you to believe that what they're going to say is really important. So he really has me engrossed in. I'm really drawn into his eyes and his voice. And he says, you know that they say when demons see Ram, they only see death. And it caught me so off guard. I was like, okay, all right. I mean, I was led to believe that it was profound because he's using the profound voice and he's looking me right in my eyes. We're really eye gazing, which is something in the New Age communities on Maui happened a lot. So I'm left to believe that this is important somehow, but I'm really confused. And I leave him there, drive back to Ram Dass's, and I keep thinking, out of all the things that he could have said, why did he say that? It was really strange. But because of the way he said it, and it was our parting moment, it stayed in my mind, and I'm thinking about it. And then I go, I have dinner, I'm doing some other things, I kind of forget about it. I sit down, and I read my nightly Ramayana story. And there's this point in the story where Ram, who is specifically God on earth, but he's the masculine form of God on earth, and he's there in a human body, and he's going into Mithila, which is the town that Sita, which is the feminine form of God on earth, manifested. And of course, Sita and Ram are not two separate beings. They're one being. Sitaram is one being, right? A being that's both masculine and feminine, is both form and formless. It's beyond anything that we can conceive of. But in the story, it manifested as two beings so that they can enact their Leela on the earth. So this is the moment where Ram is walking into Mithila, the town where Sita lives, and they're about to meet for the first time on earth. And of course, when they meet, they fall instantly in love. You know, it's the most glorious form of love at first sight, because in reality, they've known each other. They are each other for eternity. So this is about to happen in the story. And so Ram is walking through the town, and all of the townspeople are seeing Ram for the first time. And everyone sees him according to their own highest ideals. So the warriors see Ram as the most glorious warrior. And the women, specifically the single women that are looking for companions, they see Ram as the most glorious man, right? And it talks about how the ascetics, the yogis, they see Ram as they see him in his cosmic form with all of his heads and hands, right? And it talks about how the devotees see Ram as the highest source of all bliss. And then right there on the page, out of over 1,000 pages, I read this line, and it says, the demons that were there, cleverly disguised as princes, looked at Ram and saw only death. And it was just one of those moments where the hair stands on end, and it just, what's really going on here? And granted, that was a fleeting moment too.
He said, basically,
yeah. And that was a fleeting moment too, right? That was a visceral response, but it was pointing to something deeper than even me having my mind blown in that reality, in that moment. And what I've come to see about these stories is I don't care anymore about if that's something that really happened in the past or not. I have no way to know that. Some people, it's really important to them to believe that. I don't know if it's that or if it's just some mythological story or whatever. But what I know from my own felt experience is that story serves, and other stories in that realm, these spiritual stories serve as gateways into a level of reality that exists right now, right? There's an element of them where Ram and Sita meeting for the first time is happening right now in this moment, right? So by reading these stories, by doing these practices, it's doing something to us that's deeper than even our felt experience in the moment. Yeah.
Gateways, thank you so much. What a beautiful close. I had to, I'm kind of clinging in a way to Sitaram's time now at this point. But I'm really glad you shared that because I loved that story in the book. Give us your plugs of the Kripa group. How can we support the work you guys do?
Yeah, thank you. So our website, kripa.guru, is a place that people can go if they want to find out more about our music, if they want to support us, any of our service outreach that we're doing. We are under the fiscal sponsorship of Hanuman Maui, which is a 501c nonprofit. Hanuman Maui has grown out of the home that Ram Dass lived in, and we're all part of this. And essentially, we've just built a Hanuman temple on the grounds, and it's turning into this it's a loving awareness sanctuary that people can come for spiritual recharge. And so our service work is housed under them. And so then if people are interested in that, they can go to hanumanmaui.org. But our website, kripa.guru, we do accept tax-deductible donations, and that is what enables us to do the service outreach work that we're doing. And also, if anyone listening feels inspired and is looking for maybe any additional support on their path, we do offer one-on-one video chat spiritual support that we offer an entirely donation basis. There's not even a suggested donation, and it's not, there's no pressure with that. And that's a part of our desire to, again, make the teachings and practices accessible to everyone. So that's also a really big service that we've been offering. I've been finding a lot of joy in it, especially during this time of COVID. And it's been really beautiful to connect with people from all over the world on their spiritual paths. So if people go to kripa.guru, they can find out about all of that. And then, I imagine in the show notes, people can find links for where to purchase my book and things like that. I will say that all the proceeds from the book are going to support our, service outreach projects.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sitaram. It's been a pleasure. We'll definitely promote all those links in the description. And just really appreciated your time and your insights on all these different concepts. And it's really clear that you embody this practice. So I know I've learned a lot, and hopefully it was helpful for everybody else as much as it was for me. I'm also selfish and just soaking this up tonight. Come back and see us.
Thank you all.
Really, really wonderful. Just hearing all of your stories and your insights and your worldviews. Really beautiful stuff. Really appreciate you spending the time with us tonight.
Thank you all for having me here. And I'm truly honored to be here. And I think it's really cool, all the work that you guys are doing with the podcast and everything that the podcast is connected to. With the Beware How group that you have going.
Thanks, Sitaram. It's definitely a soulful project for sure, and we get to meet people like you. So we're gonna keep it going. Yeah, exactly.
So amazing.
Absolutely.
See you guys.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.